What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another special episode of whatever this is. We're rebranding the show, so we're not quite sure what this is going to be. I'm joined by a very special guest to me, Dr. Corey Stotesbury. Corey, you are you're my therapist for one.
There we go.
Which is very fascinating. So we've known each other for about a year. I've told the story on the podcast, obviously, of my claustrophobia, my dealing with that, and I've told people that I'm going to I'm seeing somebody to help me through that, and you are that somebody.
That's me, yeah.
So we were talking, obviously we've been talking for the past year, but we were talking, I'm like, what would be the best way to sort of share this experience with people? And we came up with the idea of potentially just having you on as a guest and me interviewing you about this process, what it's like spending an hour of your week in the insanity of my brain. And then just basically, therapy in general, how it's like, how people view that, if people need help. There's lots to unpack. We'll just jump right into it. How you doing so far today?
Doing good, man. I'm really excited to be here. I thank you for the opportunity. There's a lot of conversations happening right now about mental health and how to do it better, or how to help our society. And so I think it's a really great opportunity to be able to use your platform to talk about that.
I think so as well. Now, it might be a bit of... I wish our platform were slightly more professional, but take it for a grain of salt. We'll see.
Sure.
We'll see where we net out. How did you? Why? Let's go back a little bit. Let's talk a little about you. What are your certifications? How did you get into this?
Sure.
Who do you help? Give me the whole spiel.
So I'm a psychiatrist, which means that I'm a medical doctor. I'm actually an osteopathic physician, which is just a little bit different school of medicine, being that at some point in my life, I knew how to treat somebody with my hands. And of course, as a psychiatrist, I never do that anymore.
Right.
But
every time I walk in and I'm like, hey, I hurt myself in jiu-jitsu, and you're like, what are you taking? And I'm like, yeah, this needs, you're like, stop taking that.
Right. There was a moment in my past where I could have treated your back pain with these guys.
Awesome.
So that's the osteopathic side of thing, or just the medical part. And so after you finish medical school, we do residency. So we're talking like Grey's Anatomy season 1 at this point, and you pick what you want to go into. And so I elected psychiatry at that point. And so you do 4 years of adult psychiatry, and then I did an extra fellowship to learn how to work with kids. So I did that. So at this point, I am a child and adult psychiatrist, and that opens the door to being able to help people through medication management, but also psychotherapy, which is kind of where I have leaned in my career and just gotten the expertise and training in that piece. And so at this point, the iteration of how I help people or what my career looks like is really focused on those kind of opportunities to work with people long-term, more in-depth, and being kind of the agent of change for their life that they're looking to get to, rather than kind of exporting that out to another therapist. I just really like doing that stuff. Interesting.
Okay. And that kind of reminds me, so then to catch everyone up out there who may or may not be familiar with like why this relationship's happening right now, is about, I think, a year and a half ago. And I distinctly remember this. I was in Austin, Texas. We were visiting Rooster Teeth, a partner company that we work with a lot, to make some content. And I woke up in the middle of the night because my sheets were too tight on me, because I was having a claustrophobic panic attack. And I had to walk into the middle of the room, and actually considered walking out of the hotel in my underwear, because I was like, I didn't know what was going on. And at the time, I was thinking about going back to jiu-jitsu, which is ground grappling for people who don't know it out there, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And I think because I was thinking about doing that, it was giving me more and more and more anxiety. Also, of course, we just started this business. We were, the business is growing, but you run your own business. You know how incredibly fun that can be sometimes, and anxiety inducing. And so I think my overall level of anxiety was at an all-time high, although I wouldn't have said it like that. I would have said I have claustrophobia. That's how I would frame it to myself, to my wife.
Right.
And I think largely I would do that because that seems more like less like I'm in need or have a problem, or less that I need to see someone about that. Like it's just, it's like, if people have a fear of spiders, like, oh, whatever. I mean, everyone's got a little bit of a fear of something, right? But like what they don't tell you is that you're not, if you see a spider, your fucking head goes dark for a second. Sure.
And
the lights start going out, and you start going, am I going to pass out for a second? And that's a serious problem. And so I think at that point, that's when I decided to potentially find someone. And so that process was pretty long. But I should say, have been to a therapist before. My wife and I have seen couples therapists just to work on our relationship, and we occasionally touch base with them just to check in here and there, which I very much recommend to anyone who's getting into a relationship or is currently in a relationship where you think there might be some things you want to talk about, good or bad. It's never a bad idea to have, an objective voice in the room. I was like, not as subjective. So, I talked to my wife a little bit, and she was like, well, you should maybe look to try to find someone. And so I Google searched, found a bunch of people in obviously the San Francisco Bay Area. And you stood out for a couple of reasons. One, I think there was something in your bio that said you worked, I can't remember it now, but it was something about not sports, but something along the lines of like being like, I guess it was the cognitive behavioral side of it. Two, you look like you work out, which is good. I'm like, okay, this guy's going to understand that I'm trying to be an athlete. And then I guess there was a third one, which is probably the more important one, which is you take my insurance.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's something that we should touch on because, that's, it sucks to say, but in this day and age, I'm like, I couldn't at the time, still can't afford to pay full price to go see a therapist to deal with this problem.
Sure.
And so I was confronted with the idea, with that first issue right there, which is like, how badly do I want this? Because I might have to shell out hundreds of dollars a week or a month to deal with this problem. And I'm like, not that bad. So that was probably 2 to 3 months before you got an email from me.
Sure.
And then eventually it got to a point where I'm like, okay, I need to do this. Like I need to get back in the saddle. I need to get back on the mat. I need to deal with this issue that I've never dealt with, by the way, because every single time I've gone to do jiu-jitsu, I found another excuse to not deal with these panic attacks I would have in these bad positions. So I would have like I wouldn't say a situational anxiety, but it would be specifically if I'm in mount or if I'm in side control, if I'm in these spots where I can't get out, that's when, boom, that panic would kick in. And
that had been a long-term experience of those moments in jiu-jitsu happening where those things came up.
Yeah, that started. So the first time I recognized that was probably when I was 25.
Okay.
Or maybe 24, 23. So I had an old roommate of mine that was like, hey, I'm really into jiu-jitsu. And he got me to start watching The Ultimate Fighter, which is back then was I think season 1 or 2 of this cool UFC show where people, we're getting off the rails here. But he got me into UFC. He got me into the whole concept of Brazilian jiu-jitsu and like what it meant. Prior to that, of course, I had been like, I'm a karate man, or kung fu. Like I'm all stand up. And 1 second of rolling with him just obliterated that in my brain. All of that ego that I had built up and like the training that I had done prior to that in martial arts, I was like, oh God, like this is
the humbling part of.
Well, it was terrifying actually.
Oh,
like
wow.
so this was more like he got me in a spot where I'm like, I don't know what to do here.
Right.
And this is bad. And of course, being not an official trainer and me not communicating to him like this is a bad thing for me, that would happen over and over again to the point where I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna come up with a very well, I mean, I would even go as far as to like, if I knew I was going to roll with him the next day, I would get like really drunk the night before, like party the night before. So I was too hungover to go.
Right. And did you realize you were doing it for that reason at the time?
Well, maybe.
Okay.
I don't think I was as quite as in touch with myself as I was back then, or as I am now.
Yeah.
So that happened. And then flash forward 5 years later, I'm like, God, I really want to, this is when I had moved up here for the job at IGN. I'm like, I really want to give this another shot. And we had a free membership over at Kevin, what's that place? It's not. It didn't used to be called that, but you know that place like Los Metates, that gym we used to go. Thank you. Yes, that's what it was. It was Roto Racket because I used to love playing racquetball with my friends. And one time I walked in and I looked over and one of the racquetball courts had been, lo and behold, converted into a jiu-jitsu like gym. Yeah. So it was all matted and they would teach judo and jiu-jitsu and like other things. And then the other side of it was like bags and stuff. So I think they were trying to integrate a little bit more MMA there. And I'm like, well, like it's literally, I'm seeing it every day. It's in the back of my mind. I've got to try this again.
How that happens.
Yeah, right. I'm like, all of a sudden it just pops out. And so I gave it a shot and the instructor was good. But again, I think it was one of those instances where I wasn't able to, I just assumed I would get over it or not have to deal with it.
Right.
And I think in doing so, that made it worse. And so that was about 2 months of me figuring out ways to not go.
Right.
I would go maybe once a week. And then I remember specifically they started teaching judo and I'm like, oh, perfect. Because judo is more about takedowns, more about throws. So I'm like, great, I get to stand up.
Right.
And if it goes to the ground, I only have to be there for like 2 seconds before they stand us back up, which of course is not the best way to learn jiu-jitsu is not by doing necessarily judo and not jiu-jitsu. You kind of have to do jiu-jitsu, right? So I think that then flash forward. God, that must have been when that's probably 26, 27.
Oh, wow.
And then flash forward to I'm 37, and I'm like, this is a problem. Now I'm starting to get to a point where even thinking about going back to it was getting me to a point where I was noticing that I was having high levels of anxiety in elevators. Right? We talked about this a little bit, where I have to go to the front of the elevator and like sit by the keys to be able to control something, to be able to get out faster. I remember we'd be at Comic-Con, and when you were at Comic-Con and you're doing panels and stuff, that you have to go through the back halls and things like that, and they cram all the people in the panel all in one place, and I'm like, this is the worst experience of my life, but I can't show this right now because I'm with a bunch of people who are I want to be cool in front of. So there was that, and then the real kind of thing for me was I got to do, like, when I would get on airplanes, I've never had a problem flying, and then I finally started noticing it when I'd sit in the window seat and someone sat next to me. I was like, uh-oh.
Right. So like, it was progressing.
It was progressing in a very bad way.
Yeah, and I remember there was a Soul Cycle story as well.
Oh, the Soul Cycle. Fuck. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love my wife. Sure. And I want to support her in all her endeavors, just like any good husband would. Yeah. You're married. You completely understand. You can read between the lines on that. My wife would take me to Soul Cycle. Now, have you ever been to Soul Cycle before?
No, I've done spin classes, but not there. I've heard theirs is very different.
Theirs is, well, obviously, it's San Francisco, so the bikes are pretty much on top of each other because they have to maximize those revenue streams,
like
right?
This room, if that.
Oh, it would be, I mean, it's probably, I think the one in my neighborhood's a little bit bigger than this room, but yeah, it's like, there's like 40 or 50 bikes in there. Yeah. I mean, there's an ass in front of you and two asses right to the side of you. God, I can't wait for your colleagues to hear this one. You're going to be like, this guy's a psychopath. But yeah, I walked in, and you have to squeeze through the bikes to begin with. And I'd done Soul Cycle before, no problems. And there was one moment there where the class started, the lights go down, it starts getting warm. You're literally strapped in, so your feet,
that's right,
can't move. There's people all around you, and I started to lose my shit. And my wife saw it. She looked over, she started seeing me pedal slower and slower and slower, and she just looked over and she was like, breathe.
Now, she knows at this point that this is what Nick does, and she's seeing it happen. And
she has never seen it happen, I don't think, until that point.
Oh, really?
And then she looked over finally, and I think that might have been a breaking point for her. Not a breaking point, but a moment of like I need to encourage him to do something about this. Right. And so beyond that point, that's when I started actively reaching out to therapists to see if there's some way I could deal with this. And that's when I got in contact with you.
Yeah. And this was also after the bedsheet story. So we have this crescendo building of symptoms getting worse, and there being this part for you that was that you just didn't want this to continue? Or what do you think was like the moment where you're like, that's it, I've been doing this for 10 years, it's over? I think
it wasn't any one moment. I think it was a progression of, if I look up therapists, or if I look up, like, you do what everyone does, right?
Right.
How to solve claustrophobia, right? In Google, right? And that's how we solve everything these days. Right. And, you'd get, specifically, there's a big community, and obviously there's a huge online community for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, BJJ, and everyone's very supportive. And so you can actually find threads of this. But, people talk about breathing. They talk about a lot of different techniques, but ultimately the through line that I would see when I would Google this is that you have to expose yourself to this, and you have to find someone, either a instructor or someone who's a trained professional who can potentially help with the process of that. And so I thought to myself, I was like, well, maybe there's some sort of magic cure to it, but in reality, as I've discovered, is there's no real magic cure. It's just really kind of that slow, steady progression toward the goal. And then once that first easy goal is achieved, you go toward the next one, which is pretty much where you come in. And that's something that we've worked a lot together.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that is the magic cure. The formal version of the therapy is called exposure response prevention. And it's an idea that anything you're afraid of, you can overcome it. Some people talk about it as inoculating yourself to it, or just creating a tolerance to it by introducing it in small, comfortable steps that you have predefined. So it's not like, hey, I'm going to scare you, and when you come into the office, I'm going to
like
close everything.
Grab on top of you.
You have to plan it. You have to have given a person permission to exert that control or that stimulus into your life, and then you also have to have gone through the process of at least perceiving that you have learned the skills to be able to overcome it. And so that was our conversation when we first started developing your treatment plan. I mean, the first step that you did was to have you laying on the ground.
Right.
On your back. And how we got there was by breaking down, we could talk about so many different versions of claustrophobia, but the one that you had the most investment in was your tight spots with jiu-jitsu. And so we broke it down. What did it look like? What did it feel like? Where were you? I mean, in the book of psychotherapy, no detail is too small. And sure, we may overdo it a little bit sometimes, but if you go looking for things, you'll find very important pieces.
That's very important, though, right? Because to me, you would sit there and say, like, what does like kind of success look like for you, right? I'm like, well, success for me is being able to roll for however long I want, and get in any position and just be totally fine with that, right? And you're like, cool. So that's our kind of endpoint, right? That might not. And I should note that we're close to that, but that hasn't quite been the case for me. I've still noticed every once in a while I get into bad spots and I have to tap or whatever. But we can get into that later. So then breaking it back down there from that, you're like, okay, well then let's go. Okay, so that's cool. That's 10 right there. Or that's well, actually I shouldn't say 10. That's success. So what? Then you would say, like, what is, like, on a scale of 1 to 10? I remember this. You were like, what is like the worst case scenario for you? Or like, how does, like, and I'm like, well, right now, worst case scenario would be if I go in there and someone puts me in a bad spot, I will freak out, I'll tap out, and I'll have to walk outside. You're like, cool, that's 10. What's a 5? What's a 4? What's a 3? What's a 1? And I'm like, well, 1 would be me laying on the ground right now by myself and no one's around, and I just, there's a cool breeze on my face, and I can imagine, an open field. You're like, cool, let's start there,
But that 1 still created some degree of discomfort,
right? And because I knew there was a 2 after that somewhere in my future, and then
absolutely.
So there is that part of your brain, that overprotective part of my brain, at least, that was always jumping to 2, 3, 4, 5,
right. And I mean, that was even the first stage of the intervention, was me needing to tell you that you weren't allowed to do more.
Yes, which was fascinating.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, so this is a fascinating thing, right? I mean, maybe I'm self-taught, maybe it's just societal, or maybe I'm fooling myself, but the concept of always needing to achieve more is something that's kind of deeply ingrained in me, right? And so when you would say to me, your quote unquote homework, or the things that I want you to go practice today, are just literally go home tonight, same time every night, try to make it a regiment, carve out 5, 10, 15 minutes, however long it needs to be. Maybe it's 1 minute, maybe it's just lay down for a second,
right?
But do it every night. Lay down. You're not allowed to do anything else,
right?
You're not allowed to watch videos of jiu-jitsu while you're doing it. You're not allowed to put pressure or weight on you. Don't do anything crazy. Just do that. And I'm like, I don't understand. That sounds silly.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds simple. Too simple, right? I'm like, I need to have, like, I should immediately jump into it. And you're like, no. That's, so there's still, even in that part of my brain, that's like, I'm still expecting something else. Like, I'm still trying to arm myself for something else. And once I got in the groove of doing that, I'm like, oh, well, this is, like, we've just eradicated 1.
Right.
Cool. 1's good. It's done.
And I think that's part of the beauty of the method, is that you're exposing somebody or offering them space to explore something they've never seen. That if all a person does is come in and go through the same motions that they've been through, here's what I tried before, I'm going to try it again, the same thing is going to continue. I mean, many people have been given credit for the quote that the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome.
Right.
So that's what we do, is that conversation, your problem-solving mechanism went straight to the idea of laying on the ground. Well, no,
that's useless.
Let's put some weight on. You wanted to put weight on your chest, and so by restricting that, we created an opportunity that if it worked, there would be a wow moment. Whereas if you found your gains through your method, the same method you'd always done, it wouldn't have as much impact. And so I think that's what I don't know, I guess that's the question, is did we open you up to something you had not experienced? Yes,
and I think it was just a different way of thinking, which is what I had hoped would happen, right? I think the whole point of reaching out to find help is to have someone be able to give you that other perspective. And I think that's really important. Like, I can't emphasize that enough, because if you are having trouble solving a problem,
right,
and you are trying to do it, like, in your brain, you can feel like you're attacking it from many different angles, but you might not be.
Right.
And that's not to say you can't, like, a person could, like, I could not maybe have eventually done this on my own, given reading resources, things like that. I'm not saying you can't do that, but what I am saying is sometimes an outside point of view is important, because it can recognize that all the paths that you think are different are actually on the same highway, right? You might need to take that. I'm terrible at analogies, as you know. I'm even worse at sports analogies. Eventually, I'll do a sports analogy like Nick. That's not how baseball works. But you might need to take a different road to find that, and sometimes that might require a different driver. So we do that, and the next progression was, I think if I'm not mistaken, it was lay down and potentially you should put a pillow on me or something like that. But I think I skipped at that point. I was like, I think it would be cool to have, like, find a way to get someone that could sit on top of me. Luckily, I've married someone who was willing to do that, which is very important. Very important, for a number of different reasons that we don't have time today to go into. But
the quick version is that psychologically, you have given her permission to do these things. Just like I said, you gave me permission to give you instructions on things to do. She has your permission to poke the bear on your anxiety, and
she calls me the Wolverine.
There you go. and anxiety tends to hang out in our blind spots, in a place we don't want people to see. That if it were overt and a thing we were able to kind of think was a positive quality or something to be proud of, people would fix it all the time. So that's a lot of, I think, why that worked and why it was so valuable to have her, and for anybody that the more you can involve people in the conversation and the process of getting better, that's definitely like the book on how to help people, is get as many people in the game.
And that leads us to, well, so we can talk about my wife a little bit, but I also want to touch on the fact that it was a big moment for me to be like, should I tell the people out there, our community, that this is happening to me, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that was, that moment for me, I think it was not necessarily scary, because we have, the best community on the internet. We know that. We've built that. We're going to continue to build that. Shameless plug to our community for anyone that's outside. You should come. The Kind of Funny Best Friends are awesome. But, sharing that, telling the guys like what I was doing, because I would come in with like bashed up fingers once I started doing jiu-jitsu, but I didn't want to share that with them. They'd be like, what's happening to you? Or do you need help? Or is someone kicking your ass that we don't know about? But then finally being able to sort of be like, hey, this is where I'm at. I'm working on this issue. I think was good for not necessarily that, but I think it really built into like helping me in other areas of life, right? So admitting that, hey, there's this thing that I am working on right now to everyone, was this really kind of relieving moment for me, where I'm like, because no one was like, pussy, right? At least they didn't say it to my face.
Was that your assumption of what it would have been?
Yeah. I mean, because I'm a man, right? I'm a 5'8" man. Shut up, Kevin. There's a lot of bravado, there's a lot of ego built up into not ever needing help, especially in a physical manner, right? And especially in a discipline like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where you walk in and the whole point is to be dominant, is to submit someone. I mean, that's literally the vocabulary and the verbiage that people use, is like, I'm going to go in there and either choke this person out or they're going to submit to me, right? That's an intimidating thing. And to have an issue with that and be able to walk into a BJJ school and talk to a guy who's got a black belt around his waist, who is clearly has never dealt with that issue, or so I presupposed.
Right, exactly.
That's something that I'm like, well, I can't share this with people. They're going to think I'm weak. They're going to think I'm a pussy. They're going to think, I'm lesser of a man, or maybe I'll think I'm lesser of a man when I see myself in their eyes. So that was a good moment for me, because I think not only did people in the comments were they incredibly supportive, but people talk, it opened up a conversation for people to talk about their own levels of anxiety and different things. And I think that's important too, because once you start to realize that everyone has something, it's sad to say, but it's comforting. It's comforting to know that that there's no perfect human beings walking around looking down on us from atop their pillowy cloud.
Right.
Everyone's got something they could either work on or should work on or are currently working on.
Right.
I think that's good.
Well, and that's a great thing about sports in general, and that's why I've liked using, be it sports or just general performance, as a medium for helping people find change, because the allure of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on some level is that every person in that room has overcome something they didn't think they could. If it was like, come to this studio and do something really easy every day and it's going to be the same every day, business model's over. Like, it doesn't work. Nobody goes to that. Yeah. It's and
even you look at that, you look at things like yoga and you think, oh, yoga is going to be like that, but it's not. It's actually structured to the point where you can challenge yourself every day and grow in that. Or if you're me, you can sit in child's pose for 95% of it and just chillax.
Right.
But
that's even the value of that is probably existing to oppose some degree of stress or something that a person needs in their life where that's my recovery phase.
Right.
And so when life is all recovery, we don't tend to be feeling like we're doing well. And that perception that I'm not happy or that I wish things could be better, if we feel like the balance is off. And we've talked just about the idea that humans tend to operate at their best when we are getting better at something.
Yeah, that was interesting. I'm glad you brought that back because I wanted to touch on that too. Was that we talked a little bit about when people start to feel complacent or when they start to feel stagnant in their lives. And I think that was definitely a portion of what I was feeling, at least with dealing with this thing, which was the anxiety was getting worse because I wasn't dealing with it, right? I wasn't challenging myself to do it. And on some level, I was disappointed with myself and potentially, kind of a little down on myself for not being able to, figure this out.
Right.
And I think that, well, actually, I'll let you talk to that. So what is the actual psychology behind that? And then how does that play into anxiety and even going as far as how does that play into depression?
Well, so I guess there's a couple of different conversations to have there. One is about the role of diagnoses and pathology. So anxiety and depression being kind of diagnostic categories. Like we have a book, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, DSM, that says if you have this, this, and this, you meet this criteria, and now you've met the requirements for this disorder. And so there's a version of anxiety and depression that are that. But then there's also I'm sad. The Warriors lost a game, which doesn't happen very often, but I'm sad.
It'll happen more eventually. That's how sports works.
Right. And so
the Giants right now.
Yes, absolutely. And so those being run-of-the-mill things, but one psychological concept is that, so for anxiety, it is an overestimation of threat or an underestimation of personal resources to handle a threat. So I look at a cat, my brain sees a lion, turns on my sympathetic nervous system, fires up my heart rate, gets my pupils dilated. It's probably a vestigial reflex from when, if you're going to buy evolution, when we were animals.
Yeah.
Or not that we aren't animals, but so the springbok running on the savannah from a lion is engaging the exact same system we are engaging when we're in soul cycle, and it's bothering us.
Interesting.
And so the people for whom that becomes a problem is really just a place where you haven't learned the tools to manage it, and therapy becomes a process of learning that. But like you said, you can learn that in many different places. Depression is in some schools thought to be a state of hopelessness, of feeling like this will not get better. Life will not get better. I am not capable of creating betterment.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can a high level of anxiety or a high level of what I was experiencing eventually lead you down that road?
Right. So a symptom of depression can be anxiety. A symptom of anxiety can be depression.
Got it.
And I guess part of that conversation should involve saying that there is a different version of these where they are very clearly neurochemical things that you're born with, and that they're this unrelenting force that is in life, and that tends to be the type of thing that medication works really well for.
Well, that was so many different things. I'm sorry to keep interrupting you.
No, absolutely.
But that was actually an interesting moment too, because the first time when we sat down to do the initial, I forget the terminology for it, the
assessment, evaluation.
Right.
Yeah.
You asked me, you were like, do you feel like, is this something you feel like? We explored. I don't know if you actually asked me if you want drugs, but we explored the concept of going down that road of saying, like, is medication something that you're open to? Is that something that you think you want? Do you think you would need or something like that? I can't remember how you phrased it, but you phrased it very doctorally. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to solve this the old-fashioned way, which is however we need to solve. I don't know how to do it, but I don't like the idea of taking pills, because just in general across the board, like I took a Claritin this morning and I'm disappointed with myself. We can talk about that next time.
Sure. See you on Monday.
Sorry. Yeah. But so I got off track. I forgot where we were. I totally interrupted you for the 14th time.
Well, just, that part that there are some situations where I think we need to be able to have the conversation that medication is potentially even the best intervention. There's certainly, there are disorders, schizophrenia, ADHD, where the data is so clear, it's medication. Like you could do all the therapy you want with both of those disorders. You're not going to ever beat the outcomes.
You can't change the brain chemistry. Yeah.
And ADHD can have a conversation about accurate diagnosis, but that's a longer discussion. But so sure, that can be helpful. Medication can make a difference. I have seen it change lives, you know, night and day kind of stuff. But one of the underlying factors that seems to be most consistent with people getting better from a mental health standpoint is their desire to get better. And so if you come to me and say, I'd like to get better, and I say, medication, Prozac, here you go, take it every day, and you're like, I don't really want this,
right?
The chances of it helping go way down.
Interesting.
And so that was a lot of our conversation about.
Do the chances of it helping go way down because eventually I wouldn't take it anymore? Or do you think that it's just not like, it's just not in my brain the thing that's going to help me?
I think it's a very complex answer that in one regard, mental health stuff is very hard to accurately study. We don't have a lab test that can diagnose it. We don't have a brain scan that can diagnose.
We don't have one of those cool tricorders from
Star
Trek.
It's coming.
Is it?
We got to figure it out.
Good.
We'll figure it. It'll be eventually. But no, we don't have that. So the only way I can tell how to help you is to talk to you.
Right.
Even filling out charts or scales or whatever does not ever beat me talking to you. And so what inherently happens then is a lot of the research that we do on how to help people is influenced by placebo effects and by the power of suggestion. And so in that regard, I think there are definitive things like very severe depression that has suicidal thoughts, things like that. Medication beats psychotherapy alone fairly significantly.
Okay.
It's not hugely dramatic, but it still comes down to, does that person want to? And so we don't have a good answer on it because it's so hard to study, that to try to develop a study where we can completely control out and know, okay, these guys were not at all influenced by suggestion is really hard to do. So I think that's why when I'm working with people, I really try to develop a plan at all points that gets them excited. That if what we say by next week, or when we talked about goals, if you can say, man, in a year I could have this in my life, I could be this way, if I can get that emotion, that anchor of excitement in somebody, their outcomes are going to be much better. That's why involuntary psychotherapy is not a thing. Yeah,
I can imagine. Yeah, I mean that, and you know, going back to the old, I think Bruce Lee said it once, where he's like, "There's no help but self-help."
Yeah,
you have to want it first.
Right.
I think that's very important. I definitely saw that in myself too as I started to progress. Was that I wasn't willing to. I knew if I wanted to get a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, that was going to be a bigger, like, not battle in my life, but a lot more effort than it was probably for the normal person who wasn't dealing with this issue. And I think for a long time, for a good period, I'd shied away from that just because I knew it was going to be. But I mean, I'm a year in now at this point. I think we're, you know, I can't remember, we talked about it before, but I think I've almost been seeing you for a year. Last week. Happy anniversary. And been training jiu-jitsu, I think, for a little bit less time. And so I'm a year in, and still noticing that there's challenges involved in that. Right. But you know, like I've talked about before, I've said it before on some podcasts, and we talk about it a lot too. I can look back now and see the progression.
Right.
Whereas I don't think I could have seen that in that first time I walked in and scheduled that first private. Right. And we should go back into that and talk to people about that process as well. But now looking back, you know, I'm able to do 2 to 3 classes a week, and there's still anxiety that walks. Like when I walk in, I'm like, all right, you know, today might be a day where I get exacerbated and I have, you know, my gas tank runs out and I get put in a bad spot and I got to tap and I got to walk outside or I got to get some water.
So what's different about the you that does that now than the you that did that 3 years ago?
I think, well, for one, the you that does, like, me now, that is just, it's acceptable to do that, right? I don't see that necessarily as a weakness. I see that as this is just a part of the process. Yeah. And I think framing it, you mentioned something a few seconds ago that I think is important. Framing it in my mind as a positive thing is a very, very important thing.
Right.
If I walked by or a jiu-jitsu school, or I walked by, you know, or I walked into class every day and thought, oh fuck, here we go again. This is gonna be the worst thing. This is gonna be the worst thing. My heart will immediately start beating faster, and guess what? That'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. The important thing to me now is that I don't look at it as training BJJ. I look at it as basically training to get over claustrophobia, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So when I do encounter those moments, that's good. That's a good thing, right? Because it gives us that useful data to be like, okay, but how far in did you do that? Like, I remember the first time someone put me in side control and I didn't freak out. And I was like, huh.
Yeah.
And I actually had, for a good 30 seconds of breathing, just relaxing, I'm like, I am not freaking out. And then I start freaking out.
Right.
But I was like, but it wasn't an immediate reaction. I got swept. I got put in side control. And I was like, you know, I knew where to put my hands and I knew the proper way to go about trying to get out of it, because if someone's got really good tight pressure and side control, you're not getting out. But I also know this. I know these things. So I'm like, I know that I might be here for a while. Right. Just breathe, relax, and just know that if at some point you need to tap. That's fine. Right. But I was very proud of what we had done at that point, because I was because you could literally recognize, I was like, I have never been able to do this before. Right. I've never been in a spot where someone could hold me down and I'd be okay with it, you know, and just be comfortable being uncomfortable.
Right. And that gets into a conversation about flow that we could do if you want, but that just whole process of having progress checks, seeing improvement. I mean, and I guess part of the strength in that story as well is that you did not achieve the first goal we set.
Oh, what was it writing the email?
No, well, no, that took a little while too. Your initial goal the day we met was to get your which belt?
Oh, blue belt. I think I wanted the blue belt in
90 days. It was like 90 or 120 days, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was 6 months.
Because with our conversation was, what is the minimum time it would take to get that?
Right.
And you said, here's how much time it would take. Didn't happen.
No.
So why didn't you quit?
Because at some point, being goal oriented on that level, that I think that became sort of the equivalent to people doing stuff for material reasons. And I started to recognize that, where I'm like, well, you get to a place where, like, if you set that level of a goal, and you know, the belts, a lot of people will tell you that, you know, it's important to have those milestones in your training, but a lot of other people will say it's just a piece of color that you wrap around your waist to let everyone know that you didn't just start. You know, I mean, I'm very oversimplifying that. And for people who have trained, obviously, you know, there's a lot that goes into getting a blue belt. That's really hard. But at the same time, I'm noticing now that I'm having fun just training and understanding the mechanics of it and getting that muscle memory down and learning the new techniques. And ultimately, I mean, I think I'd still be disappointed if I trained for the next 5 years and never got a blue belt, but I'm just kind of enjoying the process right now.
Yeah, and that's such a cool place to be, and I agree that's what I think we've seen happen for you. So we set the kind of the summary of the story from a psychology standpoint. We set a goal, we created an emotional investment in it. Like the idea that day of like, all right, blue belt, 6 months, that's gonna be great. That created motivation. You started working toward it, and then when you got there to the point where you were like, okay, I know how to get a blue belt, I don't actually want it. And right now, that is not what's motivating me.
Right. As much as my instructor's watching, I will take one the next belt promotion. But
the motivation was the process, the enjoyment of getting there, and so to not achieve a goal because I can't is so much more difficult than I don't achieve a goal because I don't want to. And the more things that we can put in our wheelhouse and say, the way today is my choosing and is on my terms. I think there's just so much strength for wellness in that space, as opposed to the stories of can't and won't.
Yeah, well, I very much, and I think there's just so much to pile onto yourself in that regard if you start working on that, right? Because like I said before, my brain immediately goes to the 18th degree of what this could be, right? And in reality, like if you're training jiu-jitsu, like, you know, I'm around black belts. I'm around guys that have been training this for 10 to 12 to 15 years. Right. That's how long it can take to get that. Right. So if I'm thinking to myself, oh, fuck, I got to deal with this crippling like anxiety that I have for the next 10 years, that's probably not, you know, in order to achieve this goal of a black belt, that might not be enough motivation for me to keep going. Right. Whereas if I'm just like, today I'm going to train and I'm going to try to figure out I'm going to try to work on my triangle technique, right? Or my arm bar from guard, right? I'm just gonna drill that, and if I get in a bad spot, whatever. But like today, I'm just gonna focus on this. This is my strategy for training today and enjoying today's, session. Then I think that's just so much more enjoyable, right? You know, and it's so much more positive, right? As opposed to saying I'm trying to climb Everest right now. It's like, well, let's just get to. This is not even base camp. This is just like, let's get to the airport. Right. Hang out, have a latte.
But it's interesting that the narrative,
I don't drink dairy.
The narrative of child development isn't that there are a bunch of 7-year-olds, hanging around today saying, man, I really want to grow up and be that guy who gets better at things.
Right.
They want to, it's a story of how we develop heroes and the role heroes play in our lives and help us serve as guide points. And so it's a very, this story of the idea is kind of wrapped up in the concept of the growth mindset. Carol Dweck wrote a book called Mindset, the New Psychology of Success. An idea that the fixed mindset says, I was born this way, I end this way, it is immovable. People who are great were born that way with a special gift, and I was not. The growth mindset says life and people are totally plastic and modifiable, and that if we want something and are given the method to get there, we can get to anything. And that really has resonated with me in my work as a therapist, just seeing how often and predictably people can turn their lives into whatever they want when given the right method. And so it would be really great, and I think that's what is kind of cool about what we're doing today, about offering people an opportunity to hear that there are people out there like that could be those heroes. I know for me that Tim Ferriss was an example of that, where his career is really built off of innovation and trying new things and developing and testing. And that's where people who do that, like I said, I think just really exist in a great space. I think that video games offer a great entry point for that, because you get a new game, you go through learning it, you build better skill at it, especially now with games with leveling up. Like, it's this planned process.
There's literally strategy that goes into this that you have to rely on your prior experience for,
and be able to see that I am capable of getting better. Right. And so that's an interesting piece that it'll be now that we have moved. Our games were not that way. Super Mario was not. You were not better at the end of Super Mario Brothers than what you were at the beginning.
Potentially
you were
you weren't vastly better, right.
And so now these people the kids who are growing up now with that experience of, wow, I can get better at something. It'll be interesting to see what they do with life.
Yeah, it's actually pretty fascinating too, because obviously when we started doing this, I started getting more and more back into gaming, and so I had shied away from, which actually is something I've just realized right now, I shied away from those levels of experience because it took either too much of me. I would say it would take too much time, but in reality, it's the time commitment, but it's also the mental commitment, right? Of having to learn the intricacies of leveling up in the games, like fixing your weapons, leveling up your weapons, doing side quests to get different resources to make different things. Like, that's a lot of stuff that goes into that. And so I would gravitate more toward like platformers, where it's like a Mario, right? Where yeah, you do have to have the game does progress you in a certain way. You do get slightly better at it, but you don't necessarily have to worry about leveling up Mario's mushroom. It's just going to be there for you. It's not going to be there for you. And I'm like, I like that. There's simplicity that I can understand and wrap my head around there. But yeah, when you start opening up yourself to those other experiences, I think there's actually a lot to be gleaned from that. And I'm actually better at playing those games now. There's a game that I like to play a lot, or I don't think they're making it anymore, unfortunately, but it's a series called Deus Ex. And that I was drawn into it by the style of it, but it's actually a fairly complex game with a lot of RPG elements. Not a ton of strategy that has to go into it, but still there's a lot of problem solving that's wrapped up in that. And by the end of it, I'm like, oh, I get this. And then I started playing, you're familiar with games, so I went from that to BioShock. And I had hated BioShock when I first played it. I was like a pariah in the office because everyone's like, you hate BioShock? What are you, out of your mind? This is like the game. The game, yeah. I mean, like Ken Levine is a god. Like, this is a game that you play that's put on the same level as in movies like a Blade Runner or things like that. It's a cultural achievement. And I'm like, yeah, I just don't vibe with it, man. It's just like, it's not a cool shooter. I would make excuses for why I was like, I don't want to learn how to play this game. Went back and played that after playing the recent Deus Ex, and I'm like, oh, I get it. These skills that I developed over here, maybe they don't apply one-to-one, but they're applicable. I understand now the mentality I'm supposed to have in doing this, and it went from being a chore to being like incredibly enjoyable. And lo and behold, of course, I was wrong. BioShock's amazing. It is an amazing game. And I think that's something that I've seen mirrored there. But I think also the reason why I'm able to recognize that is because we've looked at the progress that I've made achieving the goals of in training jiu-jitsu, and we've applied that across the board to other things in my life, right? We've applied that to my writing, we've applied that to my stand-up comedy, things that I'm trying to achieve that I've always had as goals, but always kept in the back of my mind as saying, look, that's there, you're never going to achieve that. That's so many different steps, and you don't have what it takes, and you're not that guy. And like exactly what you're saying, which is there are people that are born to do this stuff. You're not one of those people, right? But if I'm being like, if I can toot my own horn for a second, looking back on all the things that I've accomplished, I think I am one of those people. I don't think I was born necessarily to do it, but I've clearly figured out how to get to this point where we've got this home built studio, and we're able to garner an audience of people that quasi care what we have to say. So those skills were very, very fascinating, specifically the breaking it down skill, right? What does success look like? Okay, what can we do right now to start us on that journey? And then also that mirrored sort of like anxiety scale of like, what's the worst thing that can, for instance, stand-up comedy, what's the worst thing that can happen, right? No one laughs, which by the way is way worse than you think.
And it happens all the time.
Oh fuck. It's so hard, especially with open mic comedy nights where you're just like, everyone's there just to do their comedy, then they want to leave and they don't want you to be better than them. But so that's like the worst that can happen, right? Or the worst actually, like I think could happen is like that gets recorded and someone's like, this guy's an idiot, and boom, your career is over. But that's that's not the case. And so, breaking that down, it's like, okay, what's the first thing you do? I'm like, Google open mic comedy nights. That's all I had to do for a week, right? And then working from there forward. And
so what that structure involved was coming up with something that you could guarantee to yourself you would do. So to come up with plans and say, I'm going to do this next week, and if it's going to be, I'm going to go do an open mic night at the most competitive comedy club in San Francisco. If you end up doing it, great. But the risk reward ratio is so off that in the initial phase of building momentum for goal achievement, you don't want to be going high risk, moderate to high reward. You want to go low risk, moderate to high.
It's like the, I don't know if you ever watched How I Met Your Mother. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there was a great episode where Barney's like, I could run a marathon, right? And then he just goes, and then was like, no, you have to train for that. He's like, I'll just run a marathon. And he goes and runs the marathon, and he gets stuck on the subway because his legs don't work after that. So it's similar to that, right? Which is like, you don't, if I could probably try to climb Everest right now, right? I could probably just, if someone put me on a plane, I could start, but I guarantee it would not have the correct effect, and then I'd probably never climb a mountain again.
Well, and that's where these guys out there like Wim Hof are going to, show you that I can breathe a special way, and I'm going to go climb Everest in just my boxers and not get frostbite and not die. And so it's great to see that that's out there. I can do that and achieve that, but let's make it smaller. What can we do today that you will guarantee yourself you will do, that 1 year from now will be 10%, 50% on your way to your goal, because that's a guaranteed model. That is saying that,
and that's a sustainable model too, which is this is very important, right? If my goal, in writing, for instance, was just to open up my laptop, well, there's no, I mean, I can do that. Anyone can do that, right? And that was one of the things too when I was getting stuck in a rut with a lot of, I was noticing that like because the training in jiu-jitsu was harder than I had expected, and we were dealing with, getting me to classes, and that was having an effect on me emotionally. I was like, I wasn't writing as much, and I was, that was disappointing too. And then that would also start that cycle of like, oh fuck, like I'm failing across all boards, even though I wasn't. I was progressing nicely, but you can feel like it's hard to gauge where you're at when you're in the middle of things. And so you would, we would work together, and you would say something like, well, just go to your laptop tonight, open it up. How do you write? I'm like, well, I usually write on a web browser. Cool. Open up the web browser. Then shut your laptop and do what else you want to do. Do that for 5 days straight. By the third day, I was writing.
And
by the third day, I just started putting words on paper, and I'm like, oh, I just wrote for an hour and a half.
And we've talked about that as that's kind of art of war stuff, where the indirect techniques, the flanking techniques, are the way that you want to approach things for the highest yield interventions, because you have a system in place. You have this complex psychological mental structure to keep the status quo going. Your brain thinks that today is the zenith of its ability to protect you and create greatness in your life. And so when you're like, hey, I want to change something, that's not how our brains are really designed. Unless you've like trained it to think that way. And so you have to like avoid those resistances, and that's what we did. So with jiu-jitsu, the first step you needed to do was get set up with a trainer or your coach. All right, go in. I don't want to go in. All right, email him. All right, I'll email him. Did you email him? No. So
a week went by.
What do you need? What do you need to do to get there? That was writing. Write your screenplay. I didn't write it. Why didn't you? All right. Well, and then it was using your wife again. And so so I mean, to go back to that was where I think, so everyone out there can see sort of the level of progression is.
it ain't pretty, but it is what it is, right? And so, going back to me broaching the topic with my wife and saying, look, I need you to do this. Of course, she was like, sure, I don't care. Like, spoilers, she's laid on top of me before, once or twice. And so she was like, that's cool. And I'm like, no, I need you to be serious about this so you can't like giggle and stuff. Kevin, sorry, can you bring me a tissue? And maybe a sugar-free Red Bull? Do you want one?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, there's my allergies are just the worst these days. And I keep going to different areas. So I keep going to like Austin and then like Vancouver. And every time I get off the plane, I'm like, oh, good, new pollens.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Oh, good. Yeah, just a roll of toilet paper. That's how professional we are here. Yeah. We don't? No. Why? Well, yeah, of course. Why would we? Oh, apologies. So she, of course, said yes, and then that was another kind of aha moment too, where I was like, okay, what I need you to do is just sit on me in a certain way. And I don't know if it was good or bad, but obviously there's a connection I have with my wife on a sexual level. So I'm like, well, this is a little bit easier than asking a random dude to do this because I've obviously been in this position before with my wife. And so she did it, and we would start talking, and then I had that one aha moment where I'm like, oh, I'm not freaking out right now. This is 100. I could stay here forever. This is 100. The view's great, and I can breathe, and everything's cool. Thank you, sir. And so that was a big step for me forward, because I'm like, if I could do this here, then odds are I can do it in other situations with other people. I just need to. And a big component of that was that initial email that I wrote. The reason I had a problem writing it was because I didn't want to admit that I had a problem. But the whole point of writing the email and reaching out to a coach to begin with was to tell him that I needed to work on this thing, right? And so I reached out to the head instructor at the studio that I currently go to, and he referred me to one of his brown belts. And so the next step that was just meeting with this person and like doing the initial, just doing an initial private. And I should mention, of course, there's a cost associated with this as well. So there was, I had to pay him for the private. That got a little expensive, but every time I would go in, I'm like, this is totally worth it. And again, in my brain, I'm like, I obviously want a lot of money. So am I gonna pay this much money to deal with this problem? And then eventually the risk reward of that was, yeah, I'm gonna keep doing this, because the first time I went in and did it and was able to sort of start the process in my brain for real, which is like, I'm in a gi, there's a brown belt in front of me, and if I don't tell him to stop, he'll strangle me, right? Well, Grant said he's not going to strangle me, but you know what I mean? Like he'll push me to that limit, not knowing. And so I have to I had to sit him down and be like, I'm not here to study jiu-jitsu. I'm here because I'm claustrophobic. I've had these panic attacks before in mount and in inside control and in these various positions, and I need help with this. And it was funny because I walked in with the assumption that no one in the history of ground grappling or wrestling has ever had this problem before, and that I had a weakness that I should keep in the dark because shame on me.
Yeah. How weird are you?
Yeah, exactly. And one of the first things he said to me was like, oh, what's funny? You just totally reminded me of something. When I first started, when I was like 15, I would freak the fuck out when someone grabbed my legs. So like, a technique obviously is if you're trying to pass someone's legs, you grab them, and you see this in wrestling too. You stuff their legs and you kind of climb up a little bit. And I'd never had a problem with that. I'm like, oh, people do that. It's great. But he was like, I would freak out, and I would have these crazy panic attacks, because to him that was that sort of triggering moment for him where it's like, fuck, this is real. And I'm like, huh, okay, so maybe I'm not crazy here. And then obviously I did some research and chose a studio that's or a school rather that's very has really cool people, and the head instructor is very, very cool there as well. And so a little by little, it became just kind of okay to tell people like, this is what I'm working on. And so I think I did a couple months of privates first, and it was tough. Like there were moments where like, I'm like, this is going to be difficult, but you can sort of like in the class itself and in those privates, that can be whatever you need it to be. It can literally be a 5-minute class. It could be a hour-long class of arm bars, or it could be, 20 minutes of on again, off again, like, mount escapes, things like that.
Well, and I think that would be my challenge to our society, and the microcosm of what you just laid out is so perfect, because somebody that you respected normalized it. Yeah. He said, I am that way as well. And unfortunately, due to the stigma that's associated with it, like you had to be in this place of feeling like this was a problem. Whereas if we were able to have open conversations amongst our people about how you know, I'm going to reveal my fear of something and it won't cause ruin or won't make me look weak.
Right.
That's next level development for how we help people move this stuff along. It's one thing to say, go get help. It's another thing to model how to do this well and how to have conversations about it and how to open up that line of discussion that I don't think we will see mental health achieve what it can until that becomes okay to talk about in public space.
And that's obviously part of the reason why we're doing this, right? Is to try to, at least on some level, as best as I can, help to break down that wall of that stigma that surrounds mental health, right? Of saying, like, you know, the word you mentioned the other day that you think that the word crazy will be treated in the same, like, with the same respect that the word gay is treated now, right? So it won't be used as a pejorative anymore.
Right.
People won't say, I feel fucking crazy right now. Are you crazy? Are you
Right.
crazy, right? And I never thought about that before. Similar to how, you know, when I was 15, obviously, I didn't think twice about calling someone gay or
Right.
saying something was gay, right?
Right.
Where now that word in my brain has a whole new meaning.
Right.
Having lived in San Francisco, having, you know, being 37, reading a lot, you know,
Right.
being around gay people a lot, like, obviously you treat that with a little more respect because it's real to you. Whereas I think that, yeah, again, the notion of seeing someone to help you mentally, I think is still seen, I mean, very much. I mean, people do it in the dark, right? And
Right.
it's unfortunate because you, given the nature of your client or your doctor-patient privilege, you can't talk about this stuff.
Right.
You literally can't,
Right.
or else I have to imagine, you know, a group of guys in like white lab coats come take you away
Right.
and never see you again.
Right.
I don't know if I don't know if that's how the board of medicine works or not, but
In the other way,
Yeah.
we take them away.
got it.
But I mean, and that's a good point, that the power of what we could bring to mankind, let's say, if I could end a session and go, wow, here's some great thing that happened, or if somebody could leave my office and tweet out, just had this realization and now I feel so much better, the more that iterations of that occur in the human space of information, now it's okay to talk about, and now it becomes kind of commonplace. And so that exists in fitness and in nutrition, where somebody's going to leave their personal trainer today and say something great about what they did, or they're going to go on a run and hit a personal record and brag about it. And I think when we can get to a place where people could brag about getting better with their claustrophobia, and that's just how we should talk to each other as people,
Right.
we eradicate most mental illness.
I think that, I mean, again, I think as well that is about framing, right? So I think you know, I mean, unfortunately, maybe this is just a half measure or a step that has to be taken, not a half measure rather, but the initial step of saying, like, look, yeah, people like me, like, this is something that is actually making me stronger. It's just making me stronger mentally, right? So I think that obviously the reason people like leaving the gym is because they have something physically to show for it. Like, look at how big my arms look, or look at how skinny my waist has gotten, or my six-pack abs. Like, don't you want to be like me? But there are those people that I admire that go out there and like the one thing I've always wanted to do and never had the balls to do it, largely because I just don't work out that much, is do that. Hey, here's a picture of me with my shirt off. I'm going to try this for 6 months and see if I can get better at this. But that requires a level of vulnerability that a lot of people just don't want to do. They don't want to put themselves out there that way.
Right.
But given the nature of my career, it's almost counterintuitive not to do that. Because the whole reason that people like us is because we have these shared experiences with them. Like, maybe we don't know it, but I'm sure there are people out there that are going through the same thing that I'm going through that listen to me and might be like, oh, okay, hopefully this helps, right? And I think it's getting there, and I think that's one of the things that's really important to touch on, which is that there are a lot of people out there that I look up to that do exactly what I'm trying to do right now, which is share that level of vulnerability. Say, I do have a problem, and this is how I overcome it, or maybe I failed, and there's value in that. Value in saying, like, it didn't work for me,
Yeah.
right? But I think that every time we do that, it really does break down that barrier of that presupposition of that person was born that way, right?
Right.
Like, Schwarzenegger wasn't born with a record-setting body. He had to achieve it somehow.
Well, then just listen to interviews with him, and consistently people in that, and it's in fitness, it's in investment, like venture capitalism. The hallmark of it is that you are going to strike out 99% of the time. So you got to just keep trying until it works.
Right.
And when we hear those stories, it's germane to us. It makes sense. But if I say the same thing about overcoming a mental illness, it's like, oh, but you can't. and that's just not that's not the actual experience on the treatment provider end. But because we have to, like you said, hide in the shadows a little bit, which needs to happen. We need
no, of course,
the confidentiality of it.
It's of course, it's less about you. Obviously, I'm not saying put a go out there and start tweeting about stuff. But I am saying for people who are out there that may be in a fortunate position to have something like this, I'd want to encourage them to share this because the experience has been tremendously positive for me. It's worked. And that's important to say. I think that I haven't just seen progression. I mean, I've seen progression to the point where I've got my first stripe on my white belt. I'm on the way to feeling good about being a white belt, which is generally when people get a blue belt. Right. When you start feeling like, hey, I've got a handle on things, that's when they put another belt on you because that's the whole point of it, right? Is you're supposed to always be sort of a little off kilter. And so, I think it's important to talk about that.
When I think there's a 30,000 foot version of what we've done together is that it hasn't just been we improved your jiu-jitsu, your writing, your comedy, your work here, that this has actually been a year-long process of you getting comfortable putting yourself out there. Because this
could not have happened the first time I walked into your office. Right. I could not have said, let's explore this. Oh, by the way, I do a podcast. You want to come on it tonight? Not going to happen. Right.
And so if we change the conversation to being about that, what we're actually saying is that we're not done. That there are going to be more things for us to work on and think about and challenges to create, and that Nick developing more and more challenges, who knows what is next. And I think that's so exciting to be able to say to every single person, if you go to this space to, be it therapy or something else that offers you that access to improvement, it's guaranteed. And that's so powerful.
I agree. Well, unfortunately, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was good. A solid hour on the dot almost. I would love to keep doing this, and maybe we'll have to do another one. We should actually try to do another one of these later on the road when we don't have a morning show to do in 15 minutes. Yeah, Corey, I appreciate you coming on. Man.
Absolutely.
It's been awesome. Thank you so much for all your help, obviously over the year, and for coming here today. And for anyone else out there, do you want to give anyone any parting messages on if they? I don't know if there are any resources you would like to talk about, or if they want to follow you. If you want people to follow you, if you have a Twitter, or if there's anything that you want to do there.
So my practice is SF Bay Psychiatry. That's www.sfbaypsychiatry.com. At SF Bay Psychiatry on Twitter. And then we also have a consulting arm that we're working with, like Equinox Fitness is one of our customers, as it would be. And just working on developing that kind of system for people who want to work on predictable improvement, and that is Optimum Performance Consulting, optimumperformanceconsulting.net, or at Optimum Performs on Twitter. Thank you.
Awesome.
Cool.
All right, well, I'll see you next week.
Yeah, good seeing you. Thanks.